I was seconds away from being mauled by a moose until Bigfoot came crashing out of the trees and stopped it. What the Sasquatch did to the moose next is the most brutal Bigfoot encounter captured on camera to date. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I got trapped in the worst scenario of my life. At the time, I spent most of my weekends exploring places most people never bother with. Nothing extreme. I wasn't the kind of hiker who needed to summit anything or post about it afterward. I just liked getting away from crowds and following old routes that didn't see much traffic anymore. That morning was supposed to be one of those trips. I had a backpack, a decent amount of supplies, and an old folded map I'd been using to navigate the area. I'd scouted the route beforehand and felt good about it. The trail was quiet. I was moving at a comfortable pace and feeling the kind of relaxed that only comes from being somewhere genuinely remote. Then the feeling started. Just this persistent, uncomfortable sense that somebody was paying attention to me even though I knew I was alone. Every 100 yards or so, I'd feel an almost physical pull to look over my shoulder. I tried to ignore it at first. I'd hiked alone in remote places for years and never felt anything like it, but the feeling kept coming back. After the third or fourth time I stopped to look behind me, I started wondering if something was really there. Every time, the trail was empty, just trees and a bend in the path. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was all in my head and kept hiking. About 20 minutes later, I rounded a bend and found a moose standing in the middle of the trail. It was huge. I stopped and gave it space, expecting it to wander off. It didn't. It just stood there watching me. Every so often, though, its attention would drift past me, back down the trail. Its ears would swivel in that direction, and its posture would tighten. I kept looking behind me. There was never anything there. Then the moose suddenly stomped the ground. I started backing away. Instead of calming down, it grew more agitated. It took a few uneasy steps forward, lowered its head, and fixed its eyes on me. I ran. The trail was rough, but I pushed as fast as I could. I expected the moose to give up after a short chase. It didn't. I could hear it crashing through the brush behind me the entire time. Then, somehow, it got ahead of me. When I came over a rise, it was standing in the trail again, blocking my path. This time it looked different. Exhausted, yes, but also scared. Its eyes kept flicking toward the trees to one side. Its ears twitched constantly, as if it was listening for something. I followed its gaze. The forest was silent. Then a single heavy footstep came from the tree line. The moose went rigid. Everything about it changed in an instant. The set of its shoulders, the angle of its head, the way its weight shifted onto its feet. And in that moment, looking at an animal that had been terrorizing me for the past half hour, I had a genuinely strange thought. Whatever just made that sound scared it more than I did. The moose locked its eyes back onto me and charged. I had nowhere to go. I braced myself because there was genuinely nothing else left to do. The distance between us was disappearing faster than I could process it. Then the forest exploded. Something came out of the trees to my left, so fast I didn't have time to track it. One instant, I was watching the moose close the final distance, and the next, something massive slammed into it from the side. The impact made a sound I felt in my sternum, a deep physical collision that sent both of them crashing through a stand of young birch like it wasn't there. Branches snapped, something hit the ground hard enough to shake the soil. The whole thing happened in under 2 seconds and left me standing there trying to understand what I'd just witnessed. For a moment, neither of them came back into view. All I could hear was movement, branches breaking, brush thrashing, the sound of two enormous bodies crashing through the woods somewhere beyond the trees. Every impact seemed to come from a different direction, making it impossible to tell where either of them actually was. Then I heard the moose, not the aggressive snorting I'd heard before. This was louder, sharper, a raw, panicked sound that echoed through the forest and cut off abruptly. It was the first time since I'd encountered the animal that it sounded like something was happening to it instead of the other way around. A dark shape crossed between the trees, maybe 30 yards away. It moved too high off the ground. I only caught a glimpse before it vanished again, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. It was Bigfoot. The crashing started moving deeper into the woods, then suddenly swung back toward me. Trees shook. A cluster of saplings bent sideways and snapped. That's when I stopped trying to figure out what I was looking at and started thinking about how fast I could get away from it. I backed away fast, stumbled over a root, caught myself, and put as much space between myself and the collision point as I could manage. I wasn't trying to watch. I was trying to survive. But the sounds kept pulling my attention back. Bigfoot was upright, completely, fully upright, not rearing up briefly the way a bear does, before dropping back to all fours, but standing and moving entirely on two legs. It was enormous, broader across the shoulders than anything I'd ever seen, with arms that seemed longer than they should have been. Dark hair covered most of its body. In the irregular light coming through the canopy, it was hard to hold the image steady in my mind, because my brain kept trying to map it onto something familiar and kept failing. The moose didn't flee. I need to emphasize that, because it was the part that made the least sense. After everything it had done to me, after all of that aggression and a full charge, it came right back. I heard the second collision before I saw it. Another enormous impact, more crashing, the sound of something being pushed backward through brush. The moose had recovered and engaged again. I found a position behind a large tree and watched. They collided again. Bigfoot took the hit, absorbed it, and drove back. The moose was strong. I already knew that from experience, but whatever it was throwing at this thing, the thing wasn't giving any ground. It moved with a level of balance and coordination that had no business existing in something that large. When it sidestepped, it was deliberate and controlled. When it drove forward, it used its whole body. I watched a section of trees bend and snap as they struggled through it. At one point, a crack rang out through the woods that I initially thought was a gunshot before I realized it was a tree. A real tree, not a sapling, being pushed off its base. Bigfoot grabbed the moose by the shoulder and wrenched it sideways. The moose stumbled, recovered, and came back. What struck me was the timing. Every time the moose committed to a charge, Bigfoot seemed to know exactly where it was going to be a second before it got there. It wasn't meeting force with force. It was waiting for the animal to overextend itself, then using all that momentum against it. At one point, the moose lunged through a narrow gap between two trees. Bigfoot shifted at the last possible moment. The moose missed completely and slammed shoulder first into a trunk thick enough that I couldn't have wrapped my arms around it. The impact echoed through the woods. Before the moose could fully recover its footing, Bigfoot was already moving again. What got to me was that the moose didn't quit. After everything, the chase, the circling, the exhaustion I could see in its labored movements, it kept re-engaging. Whether that was instinct or stubbornness, I couldn't say, but there was something almost terrible about watching an animal that size refuse to accept what was happening to it. Every time I thought the fight was winding down, the moose would lower its head and come back, and the whole thing would erupt again. They disappeared into a thicker section of woods, and I lost sight of them entirely, tracking the fight only by sound. Impacts, crashes, the thrashing of brush, heavy breathing I could hear even from where I was standing. The canopy shook in a section of trees, maybe 40 yards off, as something large got pushed into the upper branches. Then they came crashing back into a more open patch, and I could see them again, both of them moving slower now, the fight taking its toll. Bigfoot's technique, if you could call it that, was to absorb whatever the moose gave it and immediately use the momentum against the animal. The moose would charge, Bigfoot would redirect it, and in the fraction of a second, while the moose was recovering its footing, Bigfoot would drive into it. It happened over and over, the same pattern, each time leaving the moose slightly less able to recover than the time before. I watched it grab the moose's neck with both hands and hold on. The moose thrashed, kicked, and drove its weight sideways. Bigfoot didn't let go. They spun through a patch of open ground, crushing the undergrowth flat, before Bigfoot drove the moose into a tree trunk with a sound that carried through the entire forest. The moose went down onto its front knees. It got back up. It always got back up, but every time it did, something was different, slower, less certain. The confidence it had carried all day, the absolute territorial authority of a 1,200-pound animal that had never seriously been challenged, was draining out of it in real time, and what was replacing it was something I hadn't expected. A low sound from the moose I hadn't heard once during the entire chase. Not aggression, not the sound of an animal asserting itself. The moose sounded afraid. I forced myself to move. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to put distance between myself and whatever was happening in those trees. The fight was still going. Every time I thought it might be winding down, another crash would erupt, sometimes close, sometimes farther off, once so close to my left that I ducked and pressed myself against a tree without thinking. The sounds of the fight shifted in and out as I moved. Sometimes it felt like they were moving away from me. Then it would swing back in my direction, and I'd feel that full-body alertness again, every sense turned up as far as it would go. I couldn't shake the awareness of what I'd seen, the ease with which that creature had absorbed a full charge from a moose that had nearly run me down. If it decided to redirect that toward me, I had no answer for it. I almost got caught in it once. The sounds had drifted farther away, and I started to think I was finally putting distance between myself and whatever was happening behind me. Then a crash erupted somewhere off to my right, much closer than it should have been. I barely had time to react. Something huge tore through the trees ahead of me. Saplings folded over. Branches exploded outward. I threw myself behind a fallen log just as the moose burst into view, moving at full speed. It crossed the trail less than 20 feet away and disappeared into the woods on the opposite side. Maybe 2 seconds later, Bigfoot crossed the same stretch of trail. I didn't get a clear look at it. I only caught a glimpse of something enormous moving through the trees at a speed that didn't seem possible. Then both of them were gone again, and another collision echoed somewhere deeper in the forest. I stayed on the ground for a while after that. My legs were shaking, and I wasn't in any hurry to test whether they still worked. Eventually, I got back to my feet and kept moving. I didn't really have another choice. A few times, I heard movement somewhere off to the side, not behind me, not ahead, but running parallel to my path, keeping pace. It was far enough off that I couldn't see anything through the trees, but close enough that I couldn't write it off as random animal noise either. Something was moving with us. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe another moose spooked by the first one. I didn't believe it, but I needed a reason to keep moving instead of freezing up entirely. The saplings along the trail were damaged, not from the moose. The brakes were too high up, and some of them had been pushed in directions that didn't match a large animal moving at ground level. I saw disturbed ground in patches where the underbrush had been flattened in ways I couldn't explain. And then I started seeing tracks. Not moose tracks. I'm not a trained tracker by any stretch, but I've spent enough time in the backcountry to recognize when a print doesn't match what I expect to find. These were large, unusually large, and the shape was wrong for anything I could easily name. I didn't stop to study them. I kept running. At one point, I climbed onto a fallen log to get a better sense of where the sounds were coming from. I immediately regretted it. Through a gap in the trees, I caught another glimpse of them. The moose wasn't charging anymore. It was backing away in short, uncertain steps, its head swinging from side to side as if it couldn't decide where the danger was coming from. The creature kept advancing, not quickly, not aggressively, just steadily. Then the moose lunged again, and both of them disappeared behind the trees. A second later, another crash rolled through the forest, and I climbed down from the log and kept moving. I kept moving, but the fight kept finding me. The sounds would fade for a stretch, and I'd start to breathe again. And then another impact would erupt somewhere in the trees, close enough that I could feel it. And I'd realize they were still at it, still circling, still crashing through the same stretch of forest I was trying to escape. The sounds were supposed to be getting farther away. That was what I kept telling myself as I moved, that the crashing behind me was fading, that the fight was pulling in a different direction, that every step I took was putting more distance between me and whatever was still happening back there in the trees. For maybe 10 minutes, I almost believed it. The impacts grew less frequent. The gaps between them stretched out. I started to think I was finally getting clear. Then something slammed into something else off to my right, close enough that I felt it before I heard it, and I realized the sounds hadn't been fading at all. They'd been moving, shifting position in a way that had nothing to do with me, or maybe had everything to do with me. I couldn't tell. I just knew that what I'd mistaken for distance was really direction, and now the direction had changed. I adjusted my route, angling left toward what looked like a clearer path through the trees. 20 yards in, something crashed through the brush ahead of me, and I stopped. Not close, but close enough. I tried another way. Same result. The sounds kept showing up where I was headed before I got there, as if the forest was rearranging itself one step ahead of me. I don't know how long I stood there weighing my options before I finally accepted what was actually happening. The fight wasn't behind me anymore. It wasn't ahead of me. It was all around me, still going, and somehow I was right in the middle of it. A sudden eruption of sound tore through the trees to my left. There was no warning, no buildup. 1 second, things were relatively quiet, and the next, something large slammed into something else, hard enough to shake the forest around me. I'd been moving carefully, watching where I put my feet, and then the world to my left just came apart. I dropped immediately. The ground came up fast. I hit on my forearms and stayed there, face down in the dirt and dead leaves, because every instinct I had was telling me the same thing. Stay low. The crashing was getting closer, not directly toward me, but close enough that it didn't matter. Whatever path they were taking had shifted, and there was only a short stretch of open ground between me and whatever was tearing through those trees. They crossed maybe 10 yards to my right. I felt the impacts through the ground before I got a clear look at them. Heavy thuds rolled through the soil one after another, and then two enormous shapes burst through a gap in the trees at a speed that didn't make sense for something that large. Branches snapped apart. Pieces of bark and wood flew through the air. Something heavy hit the ground, bounced once, and disappeared into the brush. Dirt and splinters rained across my back and shoulders. I pressed myself flat and didn't move. The whole thing lasted maybe a few seconds. Then they were gone, crashing into the trees on the other side and carrying the fight with them. The sound started to fade again, shifting farther away through the forest. I stayed where I was for a while after that, trying to slow my breathing and make sense of what I'd just seen. I got back on my feet and kept moving. My hands were still shaking and my thoughts felt a little scrambled, but the trail was still there, and I still knew roughly where I was going. At that point, that was enough. I'd covered maybe 100 yards when a moose stepped out of the trees ahead of me. It wasn't charging, it just walked onto the trail about 40 feet away and stopped. For a second, neither of us moved. It stood there, breathing hard, its sides rising and falling so heavily that I could see it from where I was. One shoulder was dark with blood. Its head hung lower than it had earlier, and it looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with me. Then it looked up and saw me. The change was immediate. Its head came up. Its ears shifted forward. The exhaustion was still there, but now something else was too. I didn't know whether it actually recognized me or whether I was just another thing standing in its territory. Either way, I had seen that look before, and I didn't need any more information than that. Its weight shifted forward. I turned and ran. There wasn't any real decision involved. 1 second I was standing there, and the next I was moving as fast as I could down the trail. I heard the moose behind me almost immediately. It sounded heavier than before and not quite as fast, but it was still coming. Branches snapped. Hooves hammered against the ground. Every few seconds I expected to hear it right on top of me. Then something hit it. The sound came from behind and slightly to one side, sudden enough that I almost stumbled. The pursuit stopped instantly. In its place came the same crashing collision I'd been hearing all day, brush tearing apart, branches breaking, the heavy impact of two large bodies slamming into each other. I didn't stop to find out what had happened. I just kept running. By the time I finally slowed down, my lungs were burning, and the sounds of the fight had faded back into the forest behind me. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath, then started moving again before anything else had a chance to find me. I slowed down once the sounds had faded far enough into the distance that I could think straight again. My breathing settled. The shaking in my hands eased a little. I pulled out the map and tried to figure out exactly where I was and how I was supposed to get out of there. As far as I could tell, I had 3 options. One route cut northeast through a thicker section of forest. Another followed the terrain downhill into a low corridor between 2 rises. The third climbed a slope before leveling out and eventually reconnecting with the trailhead route. Under normal circumstances, I would have taken the lower path without a second thought. The ground looked easier, the route was more direct, and I could see farther ahead, so I started toward it. I hadn't gone very far when the sound shifted again. I didn't see anything, but I heard a sudden burst of crashing somewhere ahead in that direction. Trees shook, branches snapped. Whatever was fighting had just moved into the exact route I was planning to take. Not close enough to see, but close enough that I stopped walking. I stood there for a few seconds, watching the tops of the trees sway and trying to convince myself I wasn't actually seeing the forest move. The lower route was out. I turned and headed toward the northeast path instead. That lasted maybe 2 minutes. Movement caught my eye ahead of me, and I froze. The moose came through the trees at a fast, uneven pace, cutting across the path from one side to the other. It wasn't charging anything. It wasn't being chased, at least not that I could tell. It just looked like an animal trying to get somewhere in a hurry. It never looked in my direction. A few seconds later, it disappeared back into the brush, and the sounds of it faded into the woods. I waited another minute before moving. That left the third option, the climb. I started up the slope, taking it slowly and trying to keep an eye on everything at once. I'd made it maybe 50 feet uphill when movement below caught my attention. Bigfoot crossed the trail beneath me. It happened so quickly that for a second I wasn't even sure I'd actually seen it. One moment the trail was empty. The next, a massive figure was moving across it and into the trees on the other side. It wasn't looking for me. It wasn't tracking me. If it knew I was there at all, it didn't care. It just kept moving, focused on something else entirely. Then it was gone. I stood there on the slope for a long moment, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Every route I'd considered had been crossed by something. The lower path by the fight, the northeast route by the moose, the high route by Bigfoot. For the first time all day, I honestly had no idea where I was supposed to go next. I heard running water somewhere ahead and headed toward it. At that point, a creek seemed as good a route as any. I was halfway across when the fight crashed into the creek upstream. I dropped against the bank immediately. They crossed maybe 20 feet away. Water exploded upward. Rocks shifted and ground together under something heavy. The sounds echoed off the banks, louder. Then they'd been in the trees. I stayed still and waited. After a few seconds, the noise moved downstream and disappeared back into the forest. I stayed where I was until everything went quiet again, then finished crossing and kept moving. I had just climbed out of the creek when the moose showed up again. It stepped out of the brush about 30 feet away and stopped. It looked worse than before. One side was dark with blood, and I could hear it breathing from where I stood. It looked at me and took a step forward. Then Bigfoot appeared. 1 second it wasn't there. Next, it was standing between us. The moose's attention shifted immediately. I started backing away, slow and careful. I didn't want either of them remembering I was there. The ridge was the only option I had left. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet across at the tightest point, with the ground dropping away sharply on the right side and a rock face rising on the left. Not dangerous under normal circumstances, just a section that required attention. I was halfway across when the fight erupted below me on both sides almost simultaneously. Left side first, then right, like they'd come through the lower ground and split around the base of the ridge without either of them knowing or caring that I was directly above them. I stopped walking and sat down against the rock face. The vibration came up through the stone every time they collided. Not subtle. A deep physical pulse that I felt in my spine each time it happened. I couldn't see either of them from where I was sitting, just the trees moving below me on both sides, shaking in ways that had nothing to do with wind. I sat there and waited and tried not to think about what would happen if one of them decided to come up. I was almost across the ridge when I heard something behind me and turned to see the moose coming up the path. It was closer than I wanted it to be, and on that narrow stretch of ridge, I had nowhere to go. Before it could reach me, something slammed into it from below. The impact knocked the moose sideways off the ridge. A second later, I heard it crash into the trees below, followed immediately by Bigfoot. The fight started up again somewhere beneath me, and I didn't wait around to watch. I turned and crossed the rest of the ridge as fast as I could. I came down off the ridge and spotted them in a clearing ahead. The moose looked finished. It was still standing, but barely. Blood covered one side, and every movement seemed like an effort. It made one last push toward Bigfoot, more instinct than anything else. Bigfoot wasn't untouched either. There were wounds along its shoulder and side, dark against the fur, but it was still standing strong. Then it moved. The moose went down and didn't get back up. I stood there for a few seconds, looking at the two of them before deciding I'd seen enough. The outcome had been obvious long before the end. Bigfoot turned and found me standing at the edge of the clearing. It approached slowly. I didn't back away. My legs wouldn't have cooperated anyway. It stopped a few feet away and crouched down, reached to one side and placed something on the ground between us. A piece of the moose, clean cut, set down deliberately, oriented toward me. Then it stood back up and didn't move. I looked at the offering and then at Bigfoot, and I couldn't find a single framework that made sense of what I was seeing. Animals don't do this. Nothing I knew did this. I stood there trying to locate an explanation and kept coming up empty. 2 rifle shots came through the trees, flat and clean, maybe a quarter mile off. A hunter somewhere in the last of the light, lining up on something that had nothing to do with any of this. He never knew what was nearby. Probably went home with a straightforward story. Bigfoot turned toward the sound immediately. I started moving before I really thought about it. I pushed through the trees, found the trail, and kept going. I heard something behind me in the clearing, but I didn't turn around to see what it was. I didn't stop until I reached the truck. I climbed in, shut the door, and sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel while my breathing slowed down. The hunter never knew what had happened. As far as he was concerned, he'd fired at something in the trees and gone home. I sat there thinking about that for a while. We had been in the same woods on the same day, but somehow we'd had completely different experiences. Mine was supposed to be like every other trip. Quiet morning, familiar pack, old map. But then a moose stepped out of the trees and everything changed. I was certain that it was going to get me killed. Then Bigfoot showed up.